On the cold winter evening of February 27, 1943, a team of 9 Norwegian Commandoes arrive at the Norsk hydroelectric plant. Their mission: sabotage the Nazis' heavy water production, which is vital to Hitler and his Nazis creating an atomic bomb.
Gunnerside is a story that shows the dedication that people during the Second World War had to the cause.
We weren't talking about a weapon of the ordinary sort. This was something which was extraordinary. This was something which would change the direction of history.
This is one of the most important weapon production facilities in the entirety of Nazi Germany.
Germany gaining access to this heavy water or to the technology of the heavy water plant would have been a disaster.
In 1911 in Norway, they built the Vemork hydroelectric plant, which was a massive, massive facility.
Initially, we know it's there as a fertilization factory, as a hydroelectric facility, but the byproduct of which, heavy water, has become the raison d'etre of the plant. And this scientific gold mine, really, for want of a better expression, is, of course, courtesy of the know-how of several Norwegian scientists.
Scientists in the early 1930s discovered that Vemork's facility's byproduct is heavy water, a form of water with a unique atomic structure and properties which can be used in the production of nuclear power and weapons.
It's really another route to it. Instead of using graphite as a motoring element, it involves a deuterium oxide or heavy water. And the whole design there is to control the process of fission so that it doesn't go boom.
Harnessing something that's potentially fatal on a macro scale, with this heavy water being the catalyst for that, this alternative isotope of hydrogen.
Leif Tronstad, a Norwegian scientist, is a celebrated scientist, and he's the brilliant mind behind the idea of the heavy water process.
The head of Norsk Hydro enlists Tronstad to design a new building at the Vemork plant, dedicated to producing heavy water on an industrial scale. Around the same time, a seismic shift in Europe is about to happen, as Germany elects a new leader.
Hitler assumes power in 1933.
Hitler's Nazi regime is brutal.
Almost immediately, they begin to root out any kind of opposition that they feel is political or social.
As the grip of the regime tightens, many scientists, particularly Jewish, flee the country to pursue their work beyond the Nazi grasp.
Scientific minds, when they leave a country, it's often considered a brain drain. So the country is losing their brain or their ability to innovate or advance technology, science, research.
Germany becomes inhospitable for so many scientists, particularly these Jewish scientists, and somebody like Albert Einstein does have to leave so that he can continue to not only be a scientist, but just live his life.
Despite many bright minds fleeing the country, those loyal to the Nazi regime stay behind to continue their work. A number of scientists working on the development of nuclear energy make a revolutionary yet terrifying discovery that could give Hitler the ultimate weapon. But they were missing one key element. Meanwhile, Tronstad's designs at Vemork become a reality. And with the new 8-story plant complete, the station now has a designated heavy water production site. French and German scientists expressed their interest in obtaining large quantities for their nuclear energy programs.
Everyone who is in the region wants access to the water because it's so necessary.
Harnessing something that's potentially fatal on a macro scale, with this heavy water being the catalyst for that.
German policies became increasingly hostile towards Jews, homosexuals, and disabled people during the mid to late 1930s. Ideals of racial superiority and ultranationalism start to become more and more prevalent throughout the country.
As early as 1935, they passed the Nuremberg race laws. It prohibits interracial marriage and relationships. It prohibits other non-Aryan races or groups of people from holding jobs in the law and medicine and academia.
In March of 1938, the Nazis annexed neighboring Austria, an early sign of their true expansionist ambitions. Later that year, German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann make the breakthrough discovery of nuclear fission at their laboratory in Berlin.
These are the men who identify nuclear fission, this reaction that demonstrates or shows the way forward in terms of nuclear energy. And what do you need that for? You need that for the creation of a bomb.
Once they have that knowledge of how to create the energy, the next step in terms of using it is actually very quick.
News about the nuclear experiments in Germany travels quickly across Europe. French Nobel Prize-winning scientist Frédéric Joliot-Curie writes a letter to his Soviet colleague, alerting him of the Germans' discovery. The news also reaches Niels Bohr, a leading Danish scientist who is preparing to leave on a trip to the United States. Once arriving in New York City, he shares this news with prominent American scientists, sparking the beginning of the American nuclear energy program.
Since the news of what could be done with the heavy water had become common scientific knowledge, every intelligence agency was interested and was actively perhaps pursuing some plan of gaining access to that heavy water.
Within the span of less than a year, each major power begins to ramp up their nuclear research and experiments, recognizing the great potential of harnessing nuclear energy. In September 1939, not long after the race to harness nuclear energy, Germany's expansionist ambitions enter their next phase.
Hitler invades Poland and the ball game begins. Poland is the trigger. A lot of people did not want to go to war because they remembered the First World War. But because Poland was invaded, Britain, France, they have to fight back.
As Europe descends into war, the Nazis continue their pursuit to harness nuclear energy and develop a nuclear weapon. The French government recognizes the importance of the heavy water at the Vemork facility in Norway and begins attempts to smuggle the heavy water out of Norway.
The French recognize how important nuclear energy is and how powerful it is. So they, of course, don't want Germany to have access to it.
So in an interesting collaboration, prominent French scientists are working with the French intelligence service in trying to identify where the heavy water is being produced and get it out of Norway.
The French intelligence services approaches Jacques Allier, who, before the war, worked at the bank that helped finance the project to build the hydroelectric plant in Norway. Because of his connections, they assigned him the task of getting the heavy water out of Norway, but time was ticking.
Norway is a country that has many proud scientific advancements. Norway's an industrial innovator, a manufacturing innovator.
Norway also was sort of a reservoir of natural resources.
There's a huge number of reasons why Norway is targeted really early on. For a start, it's got absolutely crucial ports. It's Atlantic facing. If you want to win the battle at the Atlantic, you need access to their ports. You also need access to their airfields. So on the geographical front, in terms of winning a strategic war across that Atlantic facing perimeter, you need Norway.
All this makes it an even more compelling target for Germany.
French intelligence service member Jacques Allier flies to Norway with a fake passport and a fake name to meet with the director of Norsk Hydro.
They had enough foresight to realize the Germans were hell-bent on getting an atomic bomb. So they were keen on getting the heavy water out of the Norwegian hydroelectric plant before the Nazi invasion.
Once in Norway, Allier secures all the heavy water, 180 kilos worth. But he fears the Germans might be onto their plans. In order to avoid capture, Allier books 2 separate flights, one with the heavy water to Scotland and another as a diversion to Amsterdam. The Germans chose to force down the wrong plane.
We've got the heavy water, all 180 kilograms, out of Norway, and it's on the road. It's moving faster than Rommel's panzers. But the problem is, this is just a temporary setback for the Germans.
As the heavy water is secretly smuggled into France, the Nazis continue their invasion of Europe.
Germany invaded Norway in April of 1940.
The conquest of Norway by Germany tends to be seen as pretty rapid, but it does take some time to happen. And Norwegian resistance is the reason why it does take some time.
As thousands of German soldiers are deployed across the country, Norwegians put up a fierce fight. Leading some of the resistance is Leif Tronstad, the scientist who helped develop the heavy water process at Vemork. Despite the efforts of the Norwegians, they cannot hold off the German advance.
Germany, by June of 1940, is firmly in control of Norway, including the hydroelectric plant.
Having quickly gained the upper hand, the Germans continue their aggression and launch their campaign against France, only 1 month after the invasion of Norway.
Prime Minister Daladier and his military advisors think that they can hold any two-front war which may come out of this push into Poland by Germany.
The French retreat, both mentally and physically, to the Maginot Line, which is this extended network of fortifications along the Franco-German frontier.
The French, having underestimated their enemy, are overwhelmed by the onslaught of Germans pouring into their country. As the Germans begin their march to Paris, Curie worries that the stolen heavy water, hidden in France, will fall into the Nazis' hands. When it becomes clear that France cannot hold off on the Germans, Joliot-Curie and Jacques Allier decide to move the heavy water from France to England.
The problem, of course, is France is overrun and Paris is taken over by the Nazis.
Fortunately, Allier avoids Paris, and the heavy water is met in Bordeaux by a British cargo ship and is safely smuggled to England. Although both Norway and France have now fallen to the Nazi regime, the Norwegian scientist Leif Tronstad is not ready to give up.
Before the Norwegian government flees for England, before Tronstad, the great scientist, flees, they establish a resistance movement and an intelligence network around Norway. So even though Tronstad and the king and others are in exile in England, they have resources on the ground.
So Leif Tronstad knows a lot about what's going on in the plant. He has the ins and outs. He's basically created an underground spy network of his own with him at the head of this spy network. He's keeping the British informed.
So the Norwegian resistance monitoring what's happening at the plant is important, one, so that they know what's going on, that they can keep track of what the Germans are doing, but they can also report back to allies in other countries.
With his spy network, Tronstad is able to provide British intelligence constant information on the Nazis' activities at the plant.
In a war like the Second World War, information is so key at all levels. So the more information you have about what the other side is doing, the better you can plan and the better you can create your own strategies moving forward for how you want to proceed.
The Norwegian High Command in England is very important to the understanding of the resistance movement in Norway.
Once in exile, Leif Tronstad and the Norwegian High Command work closely with the British SOE, known as Special Operations Executive.
Special Operations Executive is basically counterintelligence, insurgency inside of a foreign country. They assist with resistance movements in country, for example, Norway and France.
Having had to withdraw his troops from France after the Nazis' rapid invasion, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill recognizes the potential of the SOE.
For Winston Churchill, something like the SOE is a great way to hit back at the Nazis without having to worry about invasion at the time.
Essentially functioning as an underground army, the SOE is primarily made up of civilian volunteers. One of the key groups in the SOE is known as Company Linge, which consists of mainly Norwegians who fled to England after the German invasion of Norway.
Of course people would volunteer. Their nations had already capitulated. There was no national army to join. So to escape to London, to fight some force, to join some force which would fight the Nazis, would be something which would be on the top of the mind of many of these people.
As the Nazis tighten their grip on the occupied nations of Europe, the Allies continue their nuclear research. American scientists at the University of California and Columbia University are working on various methods of harnessing nuclear power. Recognizing the potential and urgency in utilizing this great new source of energy, the British in 1941 released the Maud Report, which contains plans for producing a nuclear bomb.
So there's a real rush for them to develop a capacity. That's articulated by 1940 in the possibility of developing a uranium-based weapon.
American intelligence was now trying to beef up and meet the threat that they now have on what would become a two-front war.
December 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor and the Americans enter the war.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Only a month after the U.S. is attacked and officially enters the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt gives his approval to his science advisor for the construction of an atomic bomb. This marks the start of the Manhattan Project.
So it only takes about a month, a little over a month, for Franklin Roosevelt to give the green light on the Manhattan Project.
By early 1942, it's clear to the Allies that the Nazis are hyper-focused on harnessing nuclear energy.
The Norwegian Resistance and Intelligence Network that Tronstad helps to develop, they're providing regular updates to him while he's in England. One of the most disturbing is that Germany has dedicated itself to ramping up the production of heavy water in the hydroelectric plant.
The Germans start seriously focusing on the production of not just heavy water. They establish a uranium club. They're looking at all the different possible ways enriching uranium. They're looking at the production of these isotopes. They're looking at heavy water. They are not closing down any options.
After receiving the concerning reports coming out of Norway, Leif Tronstad suggests a small targeted operation to stop the Nazis' heavy water production. His report lands on the desk of the British Prime Minister.
Winston Churchill decides in 1942 that Vemork is a key target. It is where the heavy water is produced for the atomic weapons.
So the German operations at Vemork are a threat to the Allies. There's no question about that.
So the organization that really takes the lead in trying to prevent Germany from getting the heavy water and from trying to sabotage this hydroelectric plant is the SOE, that's the Special Operations Executive.
In the meantime, conditions in Norway are getting worse. In October 1942, the Nazis begin rounding up Jews in Norway. More than a third of Norway's 2,100 Jews were deported to death camps during the war. Tronstad and other Norwegian resistant members are desperate to do something for their country.
So yet another tragedy is the construction of concentration camps, followed by the mass construction of concentration camps. There were a number of camps, Dachau, Auschwitz, and others that had 10, 20, hundreds of satellite camps. By 1942, the complexion of the war was changing. On the Eastern Front, Hitler planned the invasion of the Soviet Union, an ambitious, if ever there was one, strategy. Operation Barbarossa, but that would not work out.
In February 1943, the Germans suffer a major defeat on the Eastern Front at Stalingrad. With over 100,000 casualties, this loss reveals that Germans are not invincible. Although things looked bad on the Eastern Front, the Germans were getting closer to developing a weapon that could change all that.
They want more of it. They want almost unlimited amounts of heavy water.
They're bound and determined to get an atomic bomb.
Recognizing the dangers of allowing the Nazis' production of heavy water to continue, the Allies are desperate to stop them. Once planning for the attack on the Vemork plant begins, Tronstad insists on a small targeted attack rather than a bombing rate.
His greatest concern is that the Allies would simply bomb the area. And in doing so, he pointed out, importantly, that it probably wouldn't do the damage that you imagine.
Despite Tronstad's insistence on a small targeted attack, he's overruled, and British soldiers begin training for a mission called Operation Freshman.
Now, how do you best eliminate a plant that's hard to reach? It's sitting at the bottom of an 8-story reinforced building. It's surrounded by Norwegian civilians, and as a bombing target is at best unlikely. The thinking is, well, you'll send in an elite task force with gliders.
Halifax bombers take off from England, and they're towing these Horsa gliders.
Throughout the war, the Allies successfully utilized gliders on various commando operations, specifically for infiltrating behind enemy lines.
Gliders are a very scary thing when you're on the inside of them. When the glider is pulled from basically its tow plane, it is on its own.
The problem is, number one, it's a long flight to Norway. Number two, the weather is horrible.
And these gliders crash on impact and kill some of the men on board. The survivors are found by the Germans, and they are all killed.
At that time, German soldiers had an order to kill any enemies that were involved with commando operations.
So that means every SOE man is killed on this raid. That means the gliders are ineffective against the Axis in that point. And that also means the Germans understand that Britain sees something in this plant.
Preventing the Germans from gaining access to the heavy water was so important that a few setbacks would not have deterred people. Even losing the element of surprise now just means you have to plan differently.
After a disastrous first attempt, the SOE turns to leave Tronstad and Company Linge to lead the next attack. This mission is given the name Operation Gunnerside.
Tronstad is the perfect person to try to disrupt the plans at Vemork. He knows it better than anybody else. He is the one who you would want to be in charge of this operation. He knows exactly what the plant is capable of, but he also knows every nook and cranny of the space. So he can best come up with a plan to disrupt what the Germans are trying to do.
To pull off this daring mission, Leif Tronstad handpicks a small team of Norwegian patriots who, like him, fled to England after the Nazi occupation of Norway. The gunnerside team is led by 23-year-old Joachim Raunberg. He's joined by Klaus Hellberg, a 24-year-old who had grown up in the area around Vemork and worked as a tour guide in the surrounding mountains prior to the war. As well as Knut Hauklid, Frederick Kaiser, Birje Stromsheim, and other members of the explosives team.
They are not formerly military trained men. They're even better than that. They are a hybrid. They are physically fit, they are young, and they have extraordinary powers of motivation because they are local and this is their patch. They want to protect it.
And they are trying to fight back against the Nazis for their country where this takes place. That makes it even more personal.
Having an intimate knowledge of the Vemork facility, Tronstad proposes that the team target the heavy water cylinders located in the plant's basement.
Tronstad knows the hydroelectric plant. So if the French, if the British, if the Americans, if the Allies are trying to get into and sabotage this plant, Tronstad becomes invaluable.
Tronstad suggests they blow up the heavy water cylinders with explosives to ensure they halt the Nazis' heavy water production. The team will then escape to Sweden.
If you want precision, you have to have precise information. This kind of information could only be provided through reconnaissance photos.
You need highly skilled intelligence to understand the way in, the way out, and where things are located inside the building.
The documents provided by Norwegian resistance at Vemork reveal that 18 cylinders need to be destroyed. With the massive increase in heavy water production, each one of these cylinders will be filled to the brim.
Every one of the cylinders housing this water needs to be taken out.
Therefore, the commandos have to go through some rigorous training. They're practicing forging rivers. They're practicing mountain climbing. They're camping, they're hiking. Their physical fitness requirements are extraordinary.
They do reconnaissance in the woods, they do code and cipher, they're taught how to read each other's communications, they're taught how to use guns, how to use metal cutters, they are taught how to climb rock faces, they already know how to ski. In many respects, they are, if you like, your Renaissance fighters, because they don't just hold a gun and do close combat fighting, but they have what's up here, knowledge of the local area, and ability to outsmart the enemy.
Before the official operation begins, a few of the gunnerside team members are sent to the Norwegian mountain wilderness surrounding Vemork to survey and prepare for the attack.
The whole mission kicks off on February 16th, 1943, as 6 Norwegians parachute onto the Norwegian countryside.
Time is of the essence. With every passing day, the Germans are ramping up and producing more and more heavy water.
The Operation Gunnerside team parachute into the Telemark region of Norway, into an area far away from any German patrol points. Their first task is to rendezvous with their teammates who arrived months earlier and are waiting for them in a cabin.
So these men who just parachuted into Norway have to traverse 60 kilometers of land to get to the cabin. This is nothing easy. This is not like taking a walk in the park.
The cabin where the gunnerside team will begin their mission is located on the Hardangervidda Plateau. Legends say that this mountain plateau grows so cold that it freezes flames in a fire.
Most of the hardship was up on the plateau getting there, where there really weren't any options, where the blizzard locked them in. What else were they going to do?
At this stage of the mission, the most important equipment they have are skis.
Skiing is synonymous with Norway.
If there were non-skiers on that team, they would have perished.
Once the team arrives at the cabin, they're hit with a massive blizzard.
Landing in the middle of a blizzard, you have to shelter in place, because if you go out into the snow in a blizzard and you don't have really any wayfinding markers, it is a death trap.
The bad weather is a delay they could do without. The clock is ticking. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans continue with their nuclear research at an unprecedented pace.
The Americans have multiple facilities, secret and semi-secret facilities around the country to develop this, from a big processing plant for uranium in the mountains of Tennessee to the University of Chicago, where some of the world's greatest physicists were gathering to work on the next steps in developing an atomic bomb.
With Manhattan successfully underway, the Americans and the British become increasingly convinced that they'll be the first to develop a military capacity, a bomb for this, and that's exactly what happens.
The Allies have no idea how close the Germans are to developing their own atomic bomb. So it's essential for Operation Gunnerside to be a success. After holding up in the cabin for a week, the weather clears, and the Gunnerside team begin their journey.
We hear about raids in the modern era, going in and finding a target, maybe being there on the ground for 2 to 4 hours and then being extracted. This raid takes well over a week.
During their training with the SOE, the Gunnerside team was shown diagrams and life-size replicas of the heavy water cylinders. They decide the best way to destroy them are with plastic explosives.
So the use of plastic explosives allows them to carry it throughout this whole operation, making the entire thing easier because they are lighter, they're more portable.
These explosives also allow for a precise and targeted explosion to take place, avoiding unnecessary damage or harm to civilians and workers at the plant, something that was essential to Tronstad and his team.
Tronstad doesn't want an air raid. He doesn't want anything that will create mass destruction to Norway. He understands that if you send in ground troops or you do mass air raids in Norway, that it's going to take years and probably decades to recover from that.
During their 40-mile journey to Vemork, the Gunnerside team skis by day and rests by night. They finally reach the gorge near the waterfall located just south of the Vemork heavy water plant.
That would be an intimidating thing to see. When you get to the plant, you see the waterfall, you finally are back there. It would have been an overwhelming moment, I imagine.
And in front of the factory is a massive ravine, a huge gorge with a bridge leading over it into the hydroelectric plant. The bridge is guarded, heavy security, which means you either have to scale down this mountain or you have to forge a deep ravine, crossing an icy waterway and climb back up to get in. All the while, it's surrounded by barbed wire, lights, guards, mines. So getting into this hydroelectric plant is not going to be an easy task.
During their occupation of Norway, the Germans stationed hundreds of thousands of troops in the country, 1 soldier for every 8 Norwegians.
The reality of the occupation, once it starts becoming apparent, is already too much for people to bear.
The occupation brings severe economic hardships to Norway. Food and other basic commodities become scarce, and the country faces a real risk of famine. The Gunnerside team waits patiently outside of the Vemork plant, observing the German guards. They know that crossing the heavily guarded bridge is impossible and have figured out an alternative way of getting inside the plant.
There is one place that they can go in, and they can find their way in, and it leads right to the plant, and that is the railroad line.
Realizing this would be their only way in via the railroad line, Raunberg leads the team down into the frozen gorge.
The valley is very windswept. You can imagine when you walk between buildings and it's really windy, that wind forces through there harder than if you're on the other side of the building. It's the same with this valley. That is a very dangerous place to be.
It's a 600-foot gorge down to the Mana River below. By the way, this is the bleak midwinter. Freezing conditions, ice, snow, and a fjord. Not even pretty in summer, by the way, that you would have to negotiate.
But once the men have successfully climbed down the gorge, the river presents a new challenge.
You have to partially go in the water. So remember how cold it is outside. Think how cold the water is. And then when you get out of this, now you're windswept and you're partially wet.
Although with the real risk of hypothermia, Raunberg pushes his men on. As even after the river, they still have a frozen 600-foot cliff to climb, which leads right to the railroad line.
So it's one thing on top of another on top of another to try to make your way to this plant. This is how important this raid is, that men are willing to go to this length to make sure that Hitler doesn't get his atomic weapon.
Incredibly, Raunberg and his men make it all the way across the gorge and reach the railway line.
Extremely challenging, extremely demanding. And let's not forget that besides all these physical demands, there's also the psychological demand of, I've not come here just for a cross-country ski trip. I actually have to go up and blow up a heavy water plant guarded by Germans.
At around midnight on February 28, 1943, the Gunnerside team is ready to enter the heavy water plant.
So the team decides to split basically half and half. There's a covering squad, provide protection, and then there's the actual team that's going to set the explosives. The team that's going to set the explosives knows from Tronstad where to go.
Thanks to his reconnaissance, they know they can enter the plant via an unguarded utility tunnel. They sneak through the narrow utility tunnel with their explosives and finally gain access to the building.
Until the last minute, they have to make adjustments and they have to tweak their plan and respond to the situation as it is developing. And they are now within sight, and all that remains is to blow up the cylinders.
There's Germans around, you're probably scared, you're making this dash, you know that you have to be quick, and any small change to the plan could throw off the entire thing.
They finally reach the basement, and there's 18 massive containers, and as Tronstad worried, their worst fears are realized. They're full.
The Commandos run into one person, one of the Norwegians who's working inside the plant, and they confront him, guns drawn because they're doing their raid, and the Norwegian actually asks what they're doing. They tell them that they're there to blow up the facility and blow up the heavy water cylinders. And the Norwegian asks, "Are you here to kill me and all of us too?" And they say, "No, we're not here to kill you." It was very important to Tronstad and others that innocent Norwegians aren't killed in this raid.
The Germans at the Vemork plant are almost exclusively guards, while the people doing the actual work of creating the heavy water are all Norwegian workers. During Germany's occupation of Norway, many Norwegians are forced to work in factories to help the German war effort. Norwegians are prohibited from flying the Norwegian flag, singing their national anthem, and even reading literature that the Germans deem inappropriate can get you sentenced to death.
The living conditions during the Nazi reign, it was deplorable. Shortages of medicine, shortages of food, people lost their jobs, homes were confiscated, freedoms and rights were curtailed, and on a drop of a dime, anybody could be accused of disloyalty. German soldiers parading through the capital. It was a horrific moment for the people of Norway.
Imagine being in Norway. Imagine being under occupation, the indignity of it, the paucity of any kind of entertainment, of decent food, of proper employment, the compromises that are constantly being made. And this is, I think, something very hard for the Anglophone world to get their head around. In Britain, we don't have the heel of the jackboot arriving in our country.
In the basement of the heavy water plant, Raunberg begins to set up the explosives. Everything has led up to these crucial final moments, and time is of the essence.
The explosives have to work in full for everything to go properly. Every one of the cylinders housing this water needs to be taken out. So they are issued explosives that are kind of like what we would think of as more like a C4 putty. It's kind of a thing that can be placed in different areas and twisted around, molded to a location, and then ignited through having a primer placed into it, which is clipped off, and then you have a few minutes to get out of there.
But halfway through setting up the explosives, it looks like the game is up.
The blast team is busy putting their explosives on the canisters when all of a sudden a window shatters next to them. Now imagine what had to go through their mind. They thought they were caught, but it was one of the teammates. Imagine the chaotic scene in their minds of what was transpiring when they realized that one of their teammates was the one who broke the window. And I'm sure that he didn't hear the end of that for a while.
After a heart-racing moment of thinking they had been caught, Raunberg continues to finish setting up the explosives. Meanwhile, Stromsheim is sent to open the exterior basement door for an easy escape while Kaiser guards the Norwegian workers. Every second spent inside the plant increases their chances of getting caught and the mission being a total failure. Once Raunberg is finished setting up all the explosives, he cuts the fuse down from 2 minutes to 30 seconds. He checks the explosives one last time and lights the fuse.
The shorter the mission, the less likely you are to get caught.
The fuses are lit, and the men exit as quickly as possible out of the plant.
I have no idea how these commandos managed to do this. To set the fuse for 30 seconds when you're in the basement of a massive hydroelectric factory teeming with Nazi guards, there's so much that could have gone wrong. But they managed to get out of the hydroelectric plant.
As they run out of the plant about 20 meters or so, they hear this distant thunk. It's not a loud bang, it's not a big explosion, it's a nice little thump. And they think, well, that's it. That must be the explosions that are going off. They're far enough away so the Germans don't see them at the time. And one German kind of looks around, and they see this guard just looking around, wondering what's going on. He appears to be thinking about what that may have been.
The gunnerside team makes their escape from the Vemork facility, and alarms eventually begin to go off. Within an hour, the facility's chief engineer and German guards arrive in the basement to find the damaged heavy water cylinders.
So it's a perfect getaway for something that sounds like it's out of a spy novel, and it works to perfection in that way. The charges are laid, cylinders are broken, the heavy water plant is disturbed for a while, and the men get away.
Raunberg and his team retrace their steps through the gorge and quickly get as far away from the Vemork facility as they can. They know the Germans will be right behind them looking for whoever had done this.
It's a highly successful operation, especially considering the odds and considering that this was somewhat telegraphed, meaning that because of the earlier failure, the Germans knew that it was a target and yet still weren't able to prevent, these very brave men from carrying out an operation of that nature.
When you think about the whole story, you think about the distances that had to be traversed and then the precision with which the plant was targeted.
The mission's a success. There's a massive amount of heavy water that literally goes down the drain. A top German general, von Falkenhorst, comes to inspect the damage. He ends up saying it's a quote-unquote most splendid coup.
The response of it, oh, it's a splendid coup, it shows that at some level there is respect between combatants in the middle of a war. For as much as you might have respected what they did from a tactical standpoint, you obviously don't want to let them get away with what they did. So you do put on this major manhunt to try to find them, because this is the sort of thing that you can't just let go. You have to respond in kind in some way.
3,000 soldiers are brought in to hunt down this handful of commandos in Norway. And to make the story even more compelling, the commandos managed to elude thousands of German soldiers combing the forests and countryside looking for them.
Although the Germans vastly outnumber the gunnerside team in both people and resources, Raunberg and his team managed to elude the Germans and make their escape.
Several of the commandos somehow managed in the middle of the winter to ski a few hundred miles to Sweden, and they outdistanced the German soldiers.
You know, they divide into two teams, and one stays in the local vicinity to try to draw the attention of German forces and basically hides in the forest and in the mountains. And then the other team skis to Sweden.
It's a pure victory. It's a wonderful local moral high point. Norwegians fighting back on the inside against their German occupiers. And then, of course, they are on skis, they separate, they spread out. They are 9 little needles in a haystack.
Having successfully sabotaged the Vemork plant, Raunberg, Kaiser, Stromsheim, and Haukli make their escape to Sweden.
Sweden is next to Norway. It's a fellow Scandinavian country. It's neutral. And from Sweden, the commandos can get out without being detected. Also importantly, even though Sweden's neutral, it's assisting the Allies in various ways, and there's an active resistance movement in Sweden, and they're helping to train the Norwegian resistance and intelligence counter forces. News of the mission reaches the Allies, as well as Leif Tronstad back in London, and of course it's welcome news.
The message Tronstad receives reads, "Operation carried out with 100% success. High concentration plant completely destroyed. Shots not exchanged, since the Germans didn't realize anything. Germans do not appear to know whence the party came or whither they disappeared." Operation Gunnerside is one of the most successful acts of sabotage during World War II, carried out by Norwegian patriots who had no formal military background. The SOE exercises are the only training they completed.
It was a clean victory, and that is the message that is transmitted back to Britain. Scot-free. We blew up the place, we blew up the cylinders. Didn't even blow up the place, they just blew up the cylinders. And we made a getaway, and we've all left with our lives intact.
Operation Gunnerside was a major success for the Allies and a crushing defeat for the Germans' nuclear weapons program. Throughout the German occupation of Norway, the Norwegian resistance proves to be a crucial asset to the Allied forces. What starts as a small sabotage unit will eventually grow into a full-on military force by the end of the war. Some of the other victories for the Norwegian resistance includes the destruction of 2 major German warships, called the Bismarck and the Tirpitz.
The Norwegian resistance comes out of that uniquely kind of Norwegian sense of identity, which means that they were not willing to be just assimilated into the Germanic Reich.
Although Operation Gunnerside was a success, by May 1943, the heavy water production facilities were rebuilt and operating once again. Later that year, in November, 140 American bombers flew over and bombed the plant. Unfortunately, 22 Norwegian civilians were killed, the exact tragedy Tronstad had hoped to avoid. But this bombing raid finally crushes Hitler's aspiration to build an atomic bomb once and for all, as the German dictator has major problems elsewhere, and troops are taken out of Norway.
Norway is no longer the priority that it was early in the war, so they have to shift people out of Norway, which is a response to what is happening elsewhere in the war.
So, you know, nothing's going right for the Germans in that capacity, and a place like Norway becomes increasingly indefensible.
While the Germans retreat from Norway, Leif Tronstad continues with his work in the Norwegian resistance, this time taking part in Operation Sunshine, an operation to protect essential installations and particularly power stations from being destroyed by retreating German forces. Tragically, Tronstad will be killed during this mission.
Tronstadt's end is therefore kind of poetic in a twisted, very ironic and sad fashion, right? Because, he dies the death that I suppose he and other resistance fighters ultimately planned for.
This kind of immortalizes him as one of Norway's great heroes, scientist, a resistance fighter, a chemist, and a fallen hero in the fight against the Nazis.
Him being part of that resistance afterwards and continuing just shows the commitment to the cause and shows how devoted he was to Norway.
This is, again, the price that some people paid for this. I mean, that would have been enough danger for a couple of lifetimes faced by people like Tronstad, but the determination to keep fighting the Nazis and to ensure that they're finally out of Norway.
Gunnerside team leader Joachim Raunberg continues his work in the Norwegian resistance and goes on to lead other sabotage operations against the Germans. It is not until 1945 when he was awarded Norway's highest military decoration, the War Cross with Sword, that he realizes the significance of what he and his Gunnerside teammates had achieved. Operation Gunnerside, the brainchild of Leif Tronstad, was a truly amazing act of sabotage. This unorthodox frontline battle was a pivotal moment during World War II, putting a major dent in Nazi Germany's atomic plans and undoubtedly changing the course of the war.
The course of history would have been completely different in a terrifying sort of way.
Gunnerside is a story that shows the dedication that people during the Second World War had to the cause.